Governor Anvesh Kumar Sikulam, First Deputy Governor, Second Deputy Governor, Ms. Florane Messi, Executive Secretary of the OECD International Network on Financial Education, members of the Bank of Mauritius Advisory Committee, Dr. Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Dr. Robert Wardrop, Director and co-founder of the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, University of Cambridge, Mr. John Cusack, Chairman of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, CEOs of banks and financial institutions, managers and heads of financial institutions operating in Rodrigues, members of the media, and our followers online. I wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this event, which will see the launch of the Bank of Mauritius Financial Literacy Strategy, and also the second edition of the Thought Leadership Series, which will understandably focus on financial literacy in a digital era. I would burden you with introductory words. I would like now to invite the Governor of the Bank of Mauritius, Mr. Anvesh Kumar Sikulam, to deliver his address. Governor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Faisal. Ms. Florane Messi, joining us virtually from the OECD, who's also the Executive Secretary of the OECD International Network on Financial Education. First Deputy Governor, Second Deputy Governor, also joining us virtually. I shall be joining the panel discussion in a little bit. Members of my advisory panel, Dr. Vera Songwe, Dr. Robert Wardrop, and Mr. John Cusack, CEOs of banks and financial institutions attending this event physically, as well as some of you virtually, managers and heads of financial institutions operating in Rodrigues, members of the media, viewers following us live on social media. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the launch of the 2022 Bank of Mauritius Financial Literacy Strategy, which we are rolling out today at a national level, and also marking the second edition of the Bank of Mauritius Thought Leadership Series. The theme for the roundtable discussion that will ensure is financial literacy in a digital era. Our eminent panelists today, who are also members of the advisory committee at the level of the Bank of Mauritius, will be providing us with their unique insights and perspectives on the importance of financial literacy and how to best implement related strategies in Mauritius. I wish to announce that the bank's advisory committee has two new members, namely Mr. John Cusack, who will be joining us as a panelist today. He is an authority on combating financial crime. John, thank you for having accepted to be a member of our advisory committee. And second, Mr. Robert Offel. Robert is the chairperson of the Autorité des Marchés Financiers of France, and also has had the privilege of being the acting chairperson of the European Securities and Markets Authority and former deputy governor of the Banque de France. Given the importance of the subject matter, it could not have been more fitting to hold this event in the very year in which the bank is marking its 55th anniversary. The unprecedented environment in which we continue to operate and which is marked by the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic magnifies the pertinence of today's event. I would not do justice to the significance of the financial literacy strategy being launched today if I fail to highlight the dangers of financial illiteracy. Indeed, a lack of financial literacy inevitably results in implementation of poor financial decisions, thereby inevitably putting at stake the lives of citizens of countries and severely impacting the very efficiency of the banking and financial systems. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot speak about financial literacy without taking heed of how past events have played a major part in reshaping the global thinking on this front. The effects of the global financial crisis on markets are indeed still fresh in many minds. History and a too late array of empirical evidence and research has shown how the lack of awareness on the part of consumers in advanced economies drove them to make flawed decisions on the subprime mortgages and synthetic instruments used for trading. The drive for higher returns, coupled with a lack of visibility on the risk side, prompted many people to invest in these securities. These events eventually highlighted the critical importance of financial literacy, prompting its inclusion as a matter of priority on the agenda of policymakers worldwide. In September 2009, at the G20 Leaders Summit in Pittsburgh, a pledge was made, and I quote, "to support the safe and sound spread of new modes of financial service delivery capable of reaching the poor," unquote. The pledge also called on financial standard setters to promote successful regulatory and policy approaches to elaborate standards on financial access. A year later, in Seoul, the G20 committed to the launch of the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion and developed a Financial Inclusion Action Plan. At the level of the United Nations, financial inclusion is positioned as a key enabler of other developmental goals in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals agenda, where it is featured as a target in 8 of the 17 goals. Ladies and gentlemen, poor financial decisions are often not only the result of financial recklessness, but also of bad planning and lack of information. The implications of these shortcomings can easily spiral beyond control. Undeniably, in today's world, many of those decisions originate from or are based upon the increasing use of technology. Add to that the consequences of buy now, pay later, targeted campaigns which can unfortunately fuel poor spending habits and ballooning debt situation. We are all aware that trust is the cornerstone for the effective functioning and stability of the financial system. As the system evolves and becomes more complex, access to financial services also becomes easier. What this implies is that there needs to be an appropriate level of financial education to enable customers to make informed decisions in a timely manner about the suitability of financial products to their specific situations. Concurrently, a robust financial consumer protection framework must be in place to shield consumers from abuse and make them become judicious users of financial services and products. This is precisely the rationale behind the very elaboration of our 2022 financial literacy strategy and the subsequent initiatives that will be rolled out in devising its financial literacy strategy. The bank has endeavored to create content that will meet the requirements of a wide target audience, encompassing our youth, our working population, as well as our elderly citizens. The strategy is intended for all consumers, and I'm pleased to share that consultation have already started with our regulatees in Rodrigues also for holding train the trainer sessions and financial literacy programs for the benefit of our Rodriguan brothers and sisters. And on this note, I would like to share our thoughts with them in these tested and difficult times that they're currently going through. The program content focuses on providing consumers with information on banking products and services, their rights and obligations, as well as how they should protect themselves and their hard-earned money. The strategy also brings to the fore the dynamic and technology-driven banking environment in which consumers of financial products are evolving. This being said, I would like to make an appeal to providers of financial services, that is, to many of you present here today. My call is that you should always act in a transparent manner with your customers by disclosing all important facts. Do not focus only on the business side or on the bottom line. More importantly, in your communication to customers, do not omit details, which, though they may seem insignificant or superfluous, may have a huge impact on the obligations and rights of customers or clients. Otherwise, in the short run, the improvement in business may come at a hefty price, be it in terms of rising delinquencies, complaints, lawsuits, or even reputational risk. Therefore, as the central banker and regulator, I need not emphasize that short-term gains are not worth a long-term pain. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a sobering reality that the pandemic has tragically claimed the lives of millions of people worldwide. The pandemic has not only led us all to rethink our existing practices, but to also factor in unexpected scenarios and reimagine opportunities. While technological advances like mobile phones, internet banking, and other digital technologies were already present in our daily lives, the pandemic has resulted in an acceleration in the pace of digitalization of financial services. As I fathom the radical changes occurring around us, digitalization is bound to amplify, both in terms of speed and the dimension of its impact, the transformation of the banking and financial landscape. While electronic channels are indeed convenient to the great majority of consumers, we should also be wary of the downside risk that they can bring. Threats of unscrupulous agents exploiting loopholes, mis-selling, and other legal risks are just some of these. I am sure that you need no further convincing about the place that financial literacy should occupy in our lives. Its benefits extend well beyond stronger household balance sheets. Indeed, financial literacy contributes to the promotion of a much more resilient financial system and ultimately to a much more efficient allocation of resources within the real economy. However, the launch of a financial literacy strategy is not on its own a sufficient condition for diffusion among the population. Collaboration and support at all levels of the banking industry remain the prerequisite for an optimal implementation of the strategy. To muster additional resources to support the implementation of its financial literacy initiatives, the Bank of Mauritius has been strengthening its relationships with other central banks, as well as with leading international financial organizations and financial literacy promotion entities. The bank is currently benefiting from the support of the Bank for International Settlements for the crafting of a strategic plan on data protection. In addition, with a view of widening the scope of its consumer education strategy and reaching out to the greater number, the bank is participating to an initiative driven by the GSBF, the Groupe des Superviseurs Bancaires Francophones. I am also pleased to share that the Bank of Mauritius is a proud and active member of the FinConnect, the International Financial Consumer Protection Organization. To further our efforts, I have personally ensured that the bank joined no later than last year the OECD's International Network on Financial Education also. I'm pleased to announce at this point that the Bank of Mauritius will participate to this year's edition of the Global Money Week, an initiative spearheaded by the OECD INFE, and which will take place from the 21st to the 27th of March next. We have even engaged with the OECD and INFE to be the national coordinator for the rollout of the Global Money Week initiatives in Mauritius. Ladies and gentlemen, as I come to the end of my address, I wish to express my gratitude to Ms. Messi of the OECD for being with us today as a keynote speaker. I also wish to thank our prime stakeholders, specifically the Mauritius Bankers Association and its members, for their valuable contribution in terms of views and inputs in crafting this program and supporting its rollout. I rely on your cooperation to make the strategy a success. On our side, you can rest assured that the bank will leave no stone unturned to reach out to the population. I thank you for your attention.
Governor, thank you for having shared your views on the pertinence of financial literacy and the role that all stakeholders across the whole spectrum of the banking industry need to play. I'm certain that your call as central banker and as regulator has been heard loud and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, I now have the pleasure of inviting Ms. Florane Messi, Executive Secretary of the OECD International Network on Financial Education, to deliver her keynote address. Florane, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, all of you. I hope you can hear me well. Good afternoon, and I would say good morning still from Paris. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be joining you at this second launch, of the Mauritius National Strategy on Financial Literacy and Inclusion. Your Excellency, dear Governor Sigolam, dear Arvesh, dear Mauritius colleagues and friends, and I see that we also have international friends, I would like to start by congratulating Mauritius for adopting the National Financial Literacy and Inclusion Campaign under the leadership of the Central Bank of Mauritius. The Bank of Mauritius' growing efforts in developing financial education and literacy policies and initiatives is also reflected, as was just mentioned by the Governor, in the fact that it recently joined the OECD International Network for Financial Education as a regular member. It has never been more timely and actually necessary to focus on increasing the financial literacy and inclusion levels of the population, especially of those most vulnerable. In fact, it was also highlighted by Governor Sigolam that young people and elderly should also be covered by financial literacy program. In fact, the COVID-19 outbreak shed a new light on the need to focus on individuals and households' financial literacy and financial resilience and enhance preparedness against various shock. Let me here address first the relevance of financial literacy in the pandemic, address briefly what the OECD and its International Network for Financial Education is contributing in the global arena. And of course, I want to spend a little bit of time on the Bank of Mauritius initiative when it comes to financial literacy. So first, a bit more on the relevance of financial literacy, especially given the COVID-19 challenges. The OECD recommendation on financial literacy, which was approved by OECD government in 2020 and recognized by the G20 last year, defines financial literacy as a combination of financial awareness, knowledge, skills, attitude, and behaviors necessary to make sound financial decisions and ultimately achieve individual financial well-being. OECD's works on financial literacy started actually in the early 2000s. And over the years, it has become ever more relevant, with countries and governments around the world acknowledging that financial literacy is a key component of a policy mix aimed at supporting consumers' financial well-being, alongside, of course, financial inclusion and financial consumer protection. This recognition was strengthened, especially after the global financial crisis, and today, as individuals face the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has weighted on the already fragile situation of households in many countries, compounding already low levels of financial resilience. The latest OECD INFE survey on adults' financial literacy and financial inclusion, conducted in 2019, just before the pandemic, showed that already before the start of the COVID-19 era, I would say, about 25% of adults indicated that they would not be able to support themselves for more than a month if they lost their main sources of income. And 31%, almost 1 in 3 adults, were worrying about paying for their normal living expenses. This really indicates the level of financial fragility and devastating economic consequences for people who have been impacted by the COVID-19 economic consequences, and clearly highlighting the potential cost of financial illiteracy, as was mentioned by the governor. Studies have showed that COVID-19 crisis primarily affected household financial resilience directly through job and income losses, but also indirectly by increasing levels of uncertainty, making it more difficult to access informal support through family, friends, and the broader community, and by increasing feelings of stress and anxiety. Financial literacy, combined with financial consumer protection and access to financial products, have been instrumental in helping consumers manage their finances in a context of income losses and economic uncertainty. They will certainly continue to be important as public support measures are phased out in the recovery phase. In 2021, for the first time, the OECD collected data not only on adults' financial literacy, but also on micro and small entrepreneurs' financial and digital competencies in COVID-19 times. It was a request from the G20 Italian presidency, and we received a mandate to develop this data collection. The report highlighted that many micro and small entrepreneurs had negative impact and actually bad outcome in terms of profit due to the COVID-19 crisis, resulting typically in lacking of cash to pay for expected expenses for the business. Concomitantly, the findings suggested a relatively low level of financial literacy of micro and small entrepreneurs in most participating countries. Encouragingly, though, higher level of financial literacy of micro and small entrepreneurs were associated with a series of positive outcomes. For example, in some participating countries, financial literacy was associated with positive business outcome, with greater awareness, for example, of public support measures for MSMEs, and with a lesser need for government support, with better access to credit, where micro and small entrepreneurs owners were better prepared to actually propose their credit support to the bank. These results highlighted the importance of financial literacy not only for individuals and households, but also for the MSMEs and the economy at large. The OECD INFE is currently updating its survey instrument to measure financial literacy, financial resilience, and financial well-being, with a view to conducting another coordinated measurement exercise in 2022-2023. This data collection is aimed at capturing the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on individuals and households. And of course, Mauritius is most welcome to join these coordinated efforts. Furthermore, recognizing the increasing push towards digitalization in the financial sector, the OECD has conducted work in deciding good practices and providing guidance on digitalization and financial literacy, as well as financial consumer protection. The G20 OECD INFE policy guidance on digitalization and financial literacy was actually adopted in 2018 and identifying effective initiatives that enhance digital and financial literacy in light of the unique characteristics, advantages, and risks of digital financial services and channels. Furthermore, the importance of the digital delivery of financial education is growing in parallel with the digitalization of our societies and economies. It is now more important than ever to ensure that the innovative use of digital technologies in the field of financial education effectively contributes to increasing financial resilience and well-being, and that government design and implement effective digital financial education initiatives. This is why, in January 2021, the OECD published a report on the digital delivery of financial education, gathering over 70 case studies from more than 40 OECD INFE member economies. Now, turning to Mauritius' National Financial Literacy and Inclusion Strategy, I'm very pleased to see that the Bank of Mauritius is scaling up its efforts to increase financial literacy in the country, and especially through leveraging technology, such as a dedicated page to financial literacy matters and the bank's website, as well as the creation of a dedicated mobile app, which will display video and script-based financial literacy content. It is also important to remember and support those that may not have access to digital devices or that may have low level of digital financial literacy. This is why the initiative of the bank to conduct train-the-trainer session for the scaling up of trainings, as mentioned by Governor Sigolem, is extremely important, and my congratulations on that. I would like to conclude by also obviously commending Mauritius for participating in the upcoming 2022 edition of the Global Money Week, as was mentioned by the governor, which is actually celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year and will be taking place between 21 and 27 of March. This is an important initiative that the OECD INFE is currently leading and which aim to increase the level of financial awareness and literacy of the youngest generation. We are happy that Mauritius will join us in this campaign this year. So I would like, ending my opening remark here, to thank you very much for the invitation. It has been an honor and a pleasure to participate in the inauguration of your campaign. So I wish you all the best for this particular event and for the campaign. Thank you very much.
Ms. Messi, thank you so much for your kind words, and especially a big thanks from the Bank of Mauritius for the endorsement that you and your team have been provided. We look forward to your support for the successful rollout of this initiative. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I now come to the most tricky part of this event, which is the panel discussion. And I, unfortunately or fortunately, have the privilege of being the moderator to this session. It will be quite a tedious task for me, but I'm sure that our panelists will enlighten us with their unique perspectives and ideas and views and case studies that they will bring to our attention. As I shared, we have the pleasure of having with us Mrs. Sadhana Surajgopal, who is the second Deputy Governor of the Bank of Mauritius. We also have the privilege of having Dr. Vera Songwe, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. We have also an eminent specialist of technology, of financial technology, Dr. Robert Wardrop, who is the director and co-founder of the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance at the University of Cambridge, and also an authority, as the governor mentioned, in the fight against financial crime. I've named Mr. John Cusack. Well, ladies and gentlemen, panelists, thank you so much for your participation. If you allow me, I would like to set just a basic question. It looks very simple, but I know the answers might be quite complex. So if I could just set the first question to Madam Gopal, Second Deputy Governor of the Bank of Mauritius, who also has the portfolio of banking supervision. So what is the significance of financial literacy in the current context?
So good afternoon, Governor, the MBA, CEOs, and our eminent panelists. Good afternoon again to you all. So Faisal, to answer your question, the significance of financial literacy, I believe that financial literacy has always played an important role. It's not starting from today, but has always been there. And today in this digital era, it's taking a much more important role. What is a literate person? A financial literate person is someone who understands financial matters, but that person need not necessarily take the right decisions. And in this digital era, where digitalization and fintech has made available to us, at the click of a button, an array of financial services and products, it has become very easy for us to take financial decisions. And this is where financial literacy has a very important role to play. Are we taking the right decisions? Because together with the ease of doing banking, having online access, there are also a number of risks associated with it. So I think I'll stop here, Faisal, and probably you will be inviting our other panelists to contribute to this very important question.
Thank you, Madam Gopal. As a matter of fact, it's not a question of politeness, but I'm setting the question again to Dr. Vera Songwe. She has, as United Nations Executive Secretary for the Economic Commission for Africa, a whole side of what's happening on the African continent. So, Dr. Songwe, what is your take on the importance of financial literacy, especially for Africa right now?
Thank you. Let me start by saying good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. And it's a pleasure to be with you today. Of course, the governor for inviting us, members of the Bank of Mauritius, participants and panel colleagues on the panel. The significance of financial literacy, I think threefold. One of them, particularly as we live in this COVID era, and was mentioned before, is really about understanding, how you manage your accounts. How do you have a budget? Particular, again, when you have your income not so certain, as we went into the COVID crisis, many of the members of the sort of financial sector on the continent do not really have a tradition of saving. And immediately, when you're in good times, savings may or may not necessarily be something that you want to do. But of course, saving is, saving for bad times. And I think educating people on how you save, as the previous colleague just said from the Bank of Mauritius, the fact that you have so many tools at the click of a finger means that the concept of saving sometimes can get out the door. People don't know what percentage of their incomes they should save for a rainy day. And I think explaining to people how that is done is particularly important. But it is also important for the providers of financial tools, particularly in the fintech space, to be able to provide the possibility for that to happen. And I give you an example. In 2018, for example, we had 23 million new users of different fintech tools in Kenya alone. Now, if they do not have within those tools the possibility to save, you can get very quickly into trouble when a crisis comes. The second one, of course, is just understanding, how you participate in different financial tools that you get. Today in Kenya, you can play on the stock market on your phone. But do you understand, what is happening? We're talking about inflation. What is the impact of inflation on investments that you're making on your phone and the stock market? I think those are the kinds of important things that we need financial literacy for. And finally, on the continent, many, many people don't have access to permanent retirement because of the informality of the sector. And so part of financial literacy is, again, building and saving and planning for the later days of your life when you need resources but do not have the capacity to earn them. So these are very important things for the continent, and I think the work that the G20 is doing and clearly the course that the Bank of Mauritius is putting on are going to be important in building the infrastructure for better financial literacy on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Songwe. And indeed, it's a very important aspect that you've underlined. You spoke about financial technology, and I would like here to be the brains of Professor Wardrop. Professor Wardrop, so in our conversation just a few days ago, you were stressing on the importance of financial literacy, especially because financial literacy is important because of technological development. How would you relate these two concepts, Professor Wardrop? I think we've got the connectivity issue, so I'll just shift the question to Mr. John Cusack. So, John, I understand that you are really connected to the live event. So, Mr. Cusack, you have a proven track record and great experience in fighting financial crime. So, why is financial literacy most important, especially right now as we are coming from the COVID context?
Faisal, thanks very much. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And Mr. Governor and distinguished guests and panelists, good to be here. When I think about financial literacy, I essentially think of trying to overcome two primary risks. The first is being able to avoid falling prey to straight out financial scams or frauds, right, which come in many shapes and sizes and are more prevalent now than they've ever been before, any other time in our history, actually. And the second is to avoid investments that just aren't right for you. For example, where returns are higher, where you really don't understand the risks, or do, but can't take the higher risks that come with it, right? Those are the two things that really concern me. And we all have to be in a position to be able to defend ourselves against those two issues because they're real and present and a real issue for all of us. I think in order to be able to do that, we need to train ourselves to be able to resist making bad financial decisions. Now, there are plenty of cases where the vulnerable fall victim to both scenarios and lose, their life savings, but it shouldn't be understood as being an issue only for the vulnerable. I have seen many, many examples of very senior, intelligent, well understood bankers even, as well as CEOs of large companies that have fallen victims to sophisticated frauds, but also quite elaborate frauds as well, and also have fallen foul to chasing higher returns and not really appreciating the risks or forgetting that those risks are real and they will come back and get many people in the future. Faisal, I'd like to talk in some detail about fraud, but I thought I'd just kick off with those initial remarks before I get into some more detailed ones about the concerns I have around fraud and cybercrime, which I think we all share, but I do think that it is time for us to take stock and really be very concerned about the precarious situation we're in, not least hopefully coming out of the COVID situation.
All right. John, if I could just move on to the next question, because you're talking about the emergence of scams, especially in this context where we are speaking about technological advancements. So what are the real challenges right now that we have to really overcome when we speak of financial literacy in this era of digital evolution?
So let me give you a few numbers. As people who know me understand that I like to flavor my remarks with some facts, which is always useful. So yesterday, the UK came out with its annual crime figures, and they were really quite staggering. Overall crime, the traditional crime was down 14% year on year. But if you add, and you should add, fraud and cybercrime, it goes up 14%. And out of all of those crimes in the UK, more than 12 million crimes in a year, 60% of those crimes were either fraud or cybercrime. And actually, there's a big connection between the two of them. And they are growing at an incredible pace, over 50% year on year in relation to the numbers of incidents. And we're talking about 1 in 8 people now being the subject of fraud or a cybercrime/fraud type event. And that's really quite staggering, because we can all assume that during our lifetimes that we are going to be targeted and we are going to be potentially the victim of one of these attacks. So it's not as though it's somebody else's problem. It's a problem that faces really all of us. I think for people listening today, especially for the banks, we obviously understand it's a real issue. Banks, bank products, bank accounts, bank cards, bank customers, and their identities are targeted more than any other sector in relation to fraud and computer misuse or cybercrime. More than 60% of all the frauds and the cybercrime attempts are in part directly or indirectly targeted towards taking people's monies away from their banks, from their accounts, from their cards, or using their identities to somehow take away monies that they have generated and want to save and put to good use, right? So this is a real and present problem. It's really changed from where we were. I mean, I sometimes like you to picture the bank branch with a teller sitting in the bank branch and a man coming into the bank branch, the classic case with the old bank robbery and the gun to the head, and he says, "Give me all your money." And the teller says, "You know, it's much easier to do this online." Right? You don't get bank robberies anymore. Or if you do, they're very rare and they're extremely dangerous for criminals to carry out, because they're usually caught and they usually go to prison for a very long time. What's happening now is that this is being done at scale from overseas, and accounts are being targeted all the time. So we're having bank robberies, they just don't make the news. We're having bank customers lose money and they're not making the news. And of course, this change that we've seen from traditional crime, which is going down, generally speaking, to new forms of crime that are incredibly, incredibly numerous, are taking over. And what's really worrying law enforcement and international policymakers is the combination of those traditional organized crime gangs with money, combining with cyber as a service criminal organizations that are very good at using technology to be able to target people and perform very sophisticated, but also not sophisticated scams. And that combination with transnational connections is an incredibly powerful combination that we have to find a better response than we have today. Would you believe that in the UK, 1% of police time is dedicated to frauds and scams, but 60% of the crimes that are now being carried out are frauds and scams and cybercrime? So we've got something wrong there. We will not solve frauds and scams, however, by only the police in pursuit or trying to arrest people and put them in prison. We will solve this, or we will counteract this, by a multi-stakeholder approach, which also includes awareness, understanding, training, and education. And that's why this is such an important session today. And I'm so pleased that Mauritius is taking the lead in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing these views. Indeed, well, I'm really shocked by the figures, especially when we speak of the of jurisdictions that are really advanced economies. And I'd like to hear from Mrs. Gopal. Well, you have the portfolio of banking supervision, madam. So what are the figures indicating in Mauritius? Is there an increase in terms of trends of financial fraud or financial fraud becoming more sophisticated, or is it simply that the net now captures also people who are not supposed to be falling prey to such scams?
Actually, Faisal, there is a mix of what you have just said. Indeed, as we are just talking about digitalization, it has made available to a number of people at a lower cost, ease of access to an array of financial products, banking products. But the downside of it has actually been that people have not assessed the risk. People are falling prey to these scams, and the fraudsters also having the time of their life. I mean, now, if you are not properly, if you have not taken the right precautions, unfortunately, you fall prey to all the fraudsters and the scams. At the Bank of Mauritius, we saw during the pandemic, while there has been the number of transactions online has doubled during the pandemic, unfortunately, we have seen on the other side a rise of fraud scams on the net, on the digital platforms. The figures have increased significantly, and they also differ on the types of scams. I mean, there are some scams on WhatsApp, there are loan scams, there are email hacking, and unfortunately also, as you know, as Dr. Vera Songwe has said, during the pandemic, people are distressed, they have been impacted financially, so they also fall prey, especially, let's say, for the people who have financially impacted, they fall prey to loan scams, seeing, you know, advertisements advertising very low rate of interest with no guarantees, etc. So we found out at the Bank of Mauritius over the last 2 years an increase in those scams. And for the elderly people, you know, in the low rate environment, when they have some savings, what they would tend, unfortunately, to do is that they have fallen prey, you know, to these lucrative scams where they actually promise you a very high rate of interest. And unfortunately, the young people, which we believe are financially literate as well, they also fall scams. They also fall prey, you know, to scams such as parcel scams, etc. And these are things that at the Bank of Mauritius, we are trying to identify, you know, how to address these issues. So to answer your question, Faisal, definitely we have seen a significant rise over the past 2 years in respect of these frauds and scams.
Thank you, Madam Gopal, for sharing this information. And I'd like to hear from Dr. Vera Songwe. If I may use this expression, is it also the same issue with the notion of that Father Christmas doesn't exist across Africa when it comes to financial investments or financial decisions? So, Dr. Songwe, what are the problems and challenges that you're facing right now across the African continent?
Thank you. I think three steps, maybe one way to put them together. The first one is, of course, knowledge. Many people, as we have said, do not have access to the sufficient set of knowledge to make the right decisions. And so being able to inform about what is the right decision to take based on your status. If you're a student, we're seeing, of course, a lot of scams around sort of how to pay student fees. The second one is, of course, behaviors. You know, what are the behaviors? And there I want to talk about it both ways, right? It's one thing to have even the citizens financially literate, but if the banking sector is not participating in the right way, and we see many financial sectors where it's essentially loan shark behavior. You know, as was just said, you know, they tell you that it's to 5% interest rate, but they don't say it's 5% per month or even per day in some countries, right? And so you say, oh my God, that's very low, and then you find yourself very quickly in a debt situation, and then your own assets are seized. And I think this is something where a lot more information, a lot more financial literacy needs to be put in place so that people understand the differences between duration of debt, the impact of inflation on you know, borrowing habits and things that they need to do. And that brings, I think, together the conversation around financial literacy and financial inclusion. Because yes, we may have huge financial inclusion numbers, but if those numbers are essentially creating for the future people who do not have any more resilience or risk in the system because they're going out and doing a lot of, loan shark or bad debt behavior, then you're getting into long-term trouble, and one needs to look at that. I think the other thing that we must look at is, again, financial literacy and the gender differentiation. What we see on the continent is that, and I think actually this data maybe holds for many other countries, we see it in the United States, most people who get scammed by financial or sort of innovative financial programs on the internet, on your phones and things, tend to be either young women or elderly women. So there is a group there, I think, that needs better education and more financial literacy. So inclusion is not enough. It's inclusion and better information for women that we tend to see on the continent as something that is quite important to do. The last thing that I just wanted to talk about is really, what is the array of products that are able to be put on which platform? And I think there is an importance in saying, what do you do when you say that you're playing on the stock market on your phone versus actually going and getting enough information from a broker about what you need to do, how you need to manage a portfolio? And I think we need both sides. And this is why the course that is being offered by the Bank of Mauritius is particularly important, because when the providers of financial access to financing are the ones providing the education, I think people trust it more and people want to come and learn. And so this is really an important step that the governor of the Bank of Mauritius and the colleagues they are doing, which allows then, I think, really for people to think about this balance between investing, saving and spending. When you're doing it on your phone, nobody is telling you, is this the right thing to do to invest today? Why don't you save? We see on the continent savings continuously dropping. And, if an economy is not saving, it's very difficult to invest and to grow. And I think this is another issue that we must begin to think about when we have this very easy financial products that are accessible by everybody. What portion of that can we really save, and what information do people need to understand what is a savings behavior? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Songwe. And now, as we were speaking of challenges, beyond the challenges of connectivity, unfortunately, in this digital era, it's good to hear that now Professor Wardrop has been able to join our live forum. Professor Wardrop, without any pun intended, what are the challenges that you see as an expert in fintech and digital development about the implementation of financial literacy strategies, especially now?
Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize for everyone for coming in so late, because I mixed up a time zone hour, and that is a major problem. And my sincere apologies to everyone. But I'm very happy to join at this point, because this is a very important issue. I think one of the major challenges that we see, and it underpins how we approach our research in our research center, the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, and that's the cadence of change. And when you address the issue of financial literacy today, and I'm at the disadvantage of not knowing what's been covered so far, and that is on me. But of course, you have to embed that in the context of the technology and the channels and the interfaces and the technology that has an impact on things like consumer products. Not just a lack of knowledge or understanding about financial products, household savings, budgets, interest rates, but obviously also issues around the technology itself. And that is rapidly evolving. And so how do you provide a full and comprehensive program that's meaningful, relevant, that produces good outcomes, that's current? Because what we saw through the COVID period, and I think we did some research with the World Bank that really highlighted how rapid the consumer behavior change was as a result of that kind of pandemic shock. And then how that stimulated innovation very, very quickly, not just in terms of online payment adoption or mobile money or e-identity checks, because it was just impractical in many ways to continue to deal with paper. Regulation with respect to eKYC to some extent was relaxed in some jurisdictions. You saw a lot of change. Of course, that opened up an opportunity for nefarious actors to move in very creatively, right? So you've got two sides of innovation happening, right? You've got on the delivery of financial services side, and then of course you have on those who wish to propagate frauds and scams, which are becoming increasingly sophisticated and have access and incentive to also invest in the technology. So one of the challenges here is what is relevant perhaps to some extent, because I think there are foundational elements that don't change. But there are some elements that become very relevant to financial literacy with the technology interface in 2022 in the context of, say, consumer harms and risks that are emerging that were not there 18 months ago. And so how do you maintain the currency of those programs you're delivering in terms of the outcomes you're seeking from individuals, particularly in the area of even as simple as password protection and using a mobile banking app? So I would say that's a pretty significant challenge, is how do you stay on top of that? And I think to really stay on top of it, the stakeholders themselves that are participating in constructing and delivering the program, they need to stay on top of it. And if you look at the developments, and I would point to the whole, just the very early stages of kind of Web 3.0 development around decentralized finance and what that means. And is there a central counterparty that I can go to, a regulator can hold accountable? And how's that? And how do you translate that into a consumer gaining an understanding of how the system works? This is a complex challenge because the technology on which the system rides is becoming more complex. And to make the system work, you need trust. In fact, what you need is system trust. People have to trust the system. And as the system gets increasingly complex, that trust becomes increasingly blind, if you will. The leap of faith gets bigger. And I think that this is a real challenge to maintain the trust as the technology gets more complex, as people, including some of the stakeholders, understand less and less about how it's really working. So how do we get through that? So I would say those are a couple of the key challenges, right? Around the sophistication that's emerging and the cadence of the change.
Right. Professor Waldrop, you were speaking about trust. Should I take it that trust is one of the prerequisites for the success of financial literacy? But what are the other ingredients that you would need for a really successful implementation? Just to point out that we are running quite short of time because we have to impart some minutes for questions from the audience. So, in a nutshell, Professor Waldrop, what are the important elements that you need for this success?
One of the most critical is who's delivering the program, because every entity has an agenda. And I think the bank is a critically important role as the trusted provider, as the trusted convener. That's critical. And I think one of the risks is, as the developments of the financial system, of financial market infrastructure increasingly decentralized, so there's less clear single counterparty centralized. The role of the bank is important, and people are going to be looking for, who's the source of the trust, right? And I think that's a challenge with financial services where people get scammed. The fear sets in, and so if you lose trust in the system, we all lose, okay? And the bank, the bank as the deliverer, as the convener, plays an extremely important role in continuing that trust.
Thank you. You were talking about the central bank, so I will set the question to Madame Gopal. So, Madame Gopal, what are the elements that you see as a sine qua non for the Bank of Mauritius financial literacy strategy to be a success within the coming months?
So Faisal will take up what the Professor Waldrop has very rightly said, is the element of trust. As the financial landscape becomes more deregulated, if I may say so, there's a number of players. Who do you trust, to impart all this financial literacy program? And I think this is where I think the central banks over the past, if I may say, the Bank of Mauritius is celebrating its 55th year anniversary. Other central banks around the world are celebrating. I know there's some of them have celebrated the 60 or 70 years. These have been trusted institutions over time. They have built up a credibility. And this is where I believe the central bank with other regulators And it's the players, such as the MBA in Mauritius, we play a very important role in the financial literacy program. And I think going forward, this is where the central bank with other stakeholders, especially in Mauritius, they can be relied upon, to have more financial literacy programs. And as we have been talking today, we have to have programs which are dedicated, which are targeted to the different audience that we have. We now are evolving in a very complex financial landscape. Products are becoming very, there's a number of products, they are very complex, they are very sophisticated. So I believe that we need to match our literacy programs to these different audience, be it students at school, be it even financially literate people, the young people, the women, and also the elderly people. So I will join what Professor Wardrop has said, that central banks, I think, going forward with other regulators, have got a very important role to play here to ensure the success of the financial literacy programs. And we should, of course, make use of the digital platform, to provide these programs. And if I may mention over here that the Bank of Mauritius, the governor is initiating a survey at the bank where we'll assess, where we'll go to the level of financial literacy in Mauritius along the different sectors, so that we'll be able to tweak our financial literacy program to fill in the gaps. So I will stop here, Fiza.
Thank you, Madam. And Dr. Songwei, when we think about a continent, we think about a machine having several gears, but each gear running at its own pace. So how do you think we can fine-tune this financial literacy strategy to ensure that all audiences, all the consumers and all types of ages find their way into understanding what we are doing?
I think, thank you. The first thing to do probably will be to ensure that all the central banks on the continent are in agreement with, what is the portfolio of lessons that we want to impact on our clients and on the consumers. And I think, again, what we're doing here today is particularly important, because maybe building up on what was said by the panelists from the OECD. The OECD now has, a plan together, but they're looking at the OECD countries. Who is looking at that? The African countries. Who is working with us? We still do have a road to travel to get to where the OECD is. But interestingly enough, we're suffering from the same problems. I think the same issues of behavior, attitude, of investments, debt accumulation. The people have the right information is not necessarily, the gaps are not so different. The benefit, I think, that the African continent have is that we have a lot more people using different internet platforms and mobile platforms for access to their financial data and activities. So we do have, this unique advantage of taking the lessons to them. Today, we have a lot of financial offerings on digital platforms. We don't have a lot of financial lessons and financial literacy lessons on digital platforms. If we could have at least 50% of financial literacy tools on these digital platforms, then probably we will be able to increase our financial literacy. So making it, and this is an idea, I don't know if the governor will agree with me, but making it almost mandatory that anybody who is offering some kind of financial product on a digital platform must accompany that with learnings, if you go on the internet today to do any kinds of portfolio investment on E-Trade or, any of those things that exist, there is a whole segment on literacy and education. Can we do that? Can we make it mandatory for all the tools that are being provided on digital platforms for consumers? I think that will be a huge start. And that will also allow us to harmonize the education set that we're sending out to the consumers. So I think this is something that probably, at least at the African level, and we could begin to work to see learning from what's happening in Asia, and particularly in the OECD with the reports and knowledge that they already have.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Songwei. Just by way of mentioning that we are working together with our main stakeholders, the banks, through the Mauritius Bankers Association, so that we can ensure that banks also are playing fully their part in supporting customers, consumers and clients in understanding the implications of the decisions they make. Mr. Kurzak, yesterday, in a very interesting phone call, you shared an image that I found very striking about people making decisions sometimes, not on the premise that they don't have the means, but because they don't understand the implications of the decision they're taking on the spot. Could you please share this with us in terms of making us understand how people should understand that financial literacy is not just a matter of banks or financial institutions bringing this information to them, but that they also have a role to play in the process?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting analogy that I've used in the past. We're all responsible for helping people improve their financial literacy, and who better than banks to do that, right? Banks know much more than most about the financial landscape. They're also, as has been said, the most trusted voice in this space, in a space which is now pretty crowded with lots of other people too. So I think banks have absolutely responsibility and the right people to do so. We also, though, as banks, and I worked in a bank for 30 years, or a couple of banks for 30 years, I think we also have a responsibility and obligation not to missell. And misselling, it can come in lots of different ways. Of course, we want to sell, and we want to sell successfully, but there is a big difference between selling successfully and being successful, and selling something that someone doesn't want, or something doesn't need, or they can't afford, or they can't take the risk, right? That's the line that we can't afford to cross. And that's a line that at occasion people have crossed, and we lose trust as a result of all of that. We're not selling bread here. We're not selling clothes here. We're not even selling cars, which yes, are an amount of money that is significant, right? The difference between what banks do and what retailers do is that people who buy goods like bread and clothes and cars know what they're buying, right? They really do know what they're buying, and they know what the price is, and they know what the market looks like, and they know whether they're getting ripped off or not. And they can make that decision. That's why we don't have regulation the same way over all those products that we do over financial products, because when it comes to financial products, it's much harder to know what you're buying. It's much harder to understand exactly what it is, how long it lasts for, what the risks are, whether I can afford it, whether or not it's something that is appropriate for me and is suitable for me, and something that I won't regret in the future. Much harder, and the only people that essentially can do that are people like us, who understand these things, and we have to be transparent, and we have to be cognizant of those particular items. As I said to Faiza yesterday, a friend of mine went into a BMW showroom to buy a Mini, because they just wanted a small car to go to drop the kids off at school and go sort of around the local community. And they were willing to spend, whatever it was, £15,000 it was, or something around that. And they knew exactly what they wanted, why they wanted it, and how much they had. But they came out with a £70,000 BMW 7 Series, which was fantastic for, long rides and fast motoring. Now, that person wasn't missold. They know exactly what they bought. It's very different, the car they came out with, than the car they went in with. And the car salesman didn't have to worry about whether or not you could also afford insurance, whether you could also fill it up even with the money that you've got. As long as you got the money and it wasn't illegal, you can buy that kind of stuff. In our world, we just can't operate that way. When we're talking about pensions and big investments, it just doesn't work that way. And we have to be absolutely responsible. We have to understand they don't usually have the financial literacy to be able to make those decisions. And we're in a fiduciary responsibility. But educating them and helping them is absolutely right. But that doesn't absolve us of responsibility in this space too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cusack. So it reminds me of something very simple when we speak about financial literacy. There's, of course, the role of regulators and other stakeholders, but there's also the fact that people should understand that you shouldn't buy things they don't need with money they don't have. Which brings me to set a question to Professor Wardrop. When we are speaking about technology, how can we use this technology as a matter of fact to gauge the success of our strategies in terms of consumer education?
Well, I'd like to make one quick comment that builds on what John said. There's a lot of confusion about trust because there are different types and forms of trust. And when we talk about banks in particular, banks will say, well, we're deeply trusted, right? Well, you might be trusted because you get the printout right, the numbers accurate on my bank statement every month. So competency trust, very, very high. But what John is talking about is alignment of values trust. That's a completely different form of trust. So you can be very trusted to get the statement right every month, and you can be very untrusted with respect, are you going to sell me something that's not in my interest?
Mm.
And I think bankers need to come to grips with this. And that's the difference with the Central Bank of Mauritius, is its alignment of values, the trust is very high. And that's why that convening power, bringing stakeholders together, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, that the banks that are operating and are not trustworthy from an alignment of values, because I don't know. But I know in many markets like the UK, that's the case. Okay. So back to kind of using the technology, I think there's a whole general, the way programs generally have been delivered and sort of particularly whether it's, let's call it capacity building and training, whether that's at the consumer level, we've dealt with it in the business school here in terms of both degree and non-degree education. What you can do in digital channel delivery today, and as a result, capture metrics with respect to learning outcomes is unprecedented. And so as you think about delivering the program, I will tell you, we haven't announced it, but, the Gates Foundation has just given us awarded us a multi-million-dollar multi-year grant, in part to deliver capacity building and training in a more digital channel efficient, measurable way, because that's a gap that they have seen relative traditional ways that is being delivered, particularly to the regulators around the world, where you fly teams in and you spend a week there and then you leave and nobody knows what happened. It's expensive to get them there. It's expensive to put them on the ground. It takes people out of their data. Think of that also as being very relevant in the consumer financial literacy space, right? And the data that you can collect about outcomes, because you're in a digital platform environment, will really help you iterate the program, because this program will be living. As I said earlier, the technology is changing, the risks are changing, the consumer harms aren't even fully understood yet. So if you want to address that in financial literacy, you're going to have to iterate. And that will be easier to do through technology platforms and data analysis, collection and analysis.
Thank you, Professor Wardrop. Madam Gopal, you were talking about the idea of launching a survey. As a matter of fact, I think it's a very important way to benchmark the level of financial literacy in Mauritius. But according to you, what would be the most tangible element in this assessment of the success of the financial literacy strategy?
If I may start, Faisal, by saying, I think that some of us in the audience today, especially in Mauritius, would remember that a few years' time we had a major scandal in Mauritius about a Ponzi scheme. So the way I think I would measure the success of our financial literacy strategies in a few years is if a number of complaints of Ponzi schemes, of scams really go down. We had a couple of people coming to complain at the doorstep of the bank, and our staff had to work on a Saturday. It was a very, very unpleasant experience. So to go to the success of the financial literacy program, I think if we can see a reduction in complaints, and as Professor Wardrop has said, the players play fair, if I may say, they play fair, and as Dr. Vera Songwe has said, together with the complex products that they are putting on the platform at the same time, maybe something that we can work together with all the regulators and the stakeholders is probably ask these people, whenever they are paying a license, to include also a percentage of the license fee for financial literacy, and of course the appropriate financial literacy. So I think these are things that we need to work on to achieve, to succeed going forward.
Thank you, Madam. Dr. Songwe, do you also view this, the requirements of making this mandatory or imposing some sort of fee so that commercial entities also participate in this process? So according to you, how to measure this effectiveness across Africa?
I think Dr. Gopal has already given a couple of very clear indications. I think we know of some of the larger schemes that exist on the continent, and I think just getting a sense that they are reducing will be important. But I think another way of doing it, maybe, and something that we don't talk about maybe in this context as well, is the equivalent in some sense of financial literacy for the individual on the bank side is how you manage your NPLs. And the governor may be smiling because we talk about that a lot. But we don't have enough of information around sort of credit scoring for many of the individuals that are playing on those platforms. And I think if we could build credit scoring facilities for, some of the small and medium enterprises or even individuals or students, so that they begin to learn that, there is a price, a positive and or a negative price based on your behavior and how you access financial tools, then because there is some personal responsibility, right, in trying to understand what you're doing. So that's one. So we will increase the financial literacy of the individuals. But then secondly, I think I'm a believer in taxes, but I think that you have to be careful about how you levy taxes, particularly in an area where we are trying to ensure that there is more inclusion. If we begin to sort of levy taxes now on, the sort of small and medium enterprise woman or the younger who needs to go to school and looking for an education loan, we may get a contrary reaction. So just putting a blanket fee on every product that is provided or supplied on some of these platforms may not be the most optimal way to do that. So I think I will think twice about maybe just doing it that way. But there is probably, I would say, there could be an incentive structure that says that if you can, provide us with a database of financial literate products that you have put on your sort of platforms and are actually providing this education, then you get access to something different, right? So maybe the Bank of Mauritius can supply some kind of differentiated services or, awards. Sometimes people do it just for recognition. I think one can do this different things like that allows for better financial literacy and not necessarily directly. Remember that financial literacy, we're talking because we're trying to do more inclusion, which means that most likely you're talking about the bottom of the pillar to begin with. And so adding taxes to that may not be the right way to do it. How do we know that we are succeeding? I think that that you're succeeding if we are able to build databases on sort of financial information of the individual and share that information with the individual, as the OECD has done. For example, you begin to look at, do people pay their bills on time? What is the proportion of people paying bills on time? What's the proportion of savings that is going up or going down? There are other indicators that begin to give you a sense that, yes, these people are getting it, and this person now has a budget, and we can see with technology today, we can almost track people's spending, right? You can see whether people are spending within their means or are they buying going in to buy a Mini and coming out with a Rolls Royce. I think one can begin to look at that and get a better sense of whether you're getting. And then, of course, the rates of bankruptcies or the rates of sort of people falling into a more vulnerability will also give you a sense of what is happening in the financial literacy area. So there's many ways of approaching it. We can, and I think as the governor of the Bank of Mauritius is doing, maybe at some point standardize these courses and offer them in schools, offer them in different places so people have quick access to them as a way, because there is also the problem of access and where one gets it. So I think if one were to be able to do some of these things, you will get there faster. If you were told that over 2 years, if your financial performance was better, you will get access to a better loan, then somebody will begin to understand, how can I save more? How can I plan more? Can I ensure that I don't I live within my means? So it's the whole sort of behavior, the attitude, because you have more knowledge that you can do. So my sense is if we start with those sort of rather, I would say, soft approaches, then we will begin to see some better results coming out on the other side. The beauty of technology and the platforms we have now is that we have so much data. We can analyze so much. And I think using even just the data we already have to ensure that we create data. In the US, you have credit scores. And maybe you begin to get people to begin to get more comfortable with their credit scores, which is something that sort of manage this whole range of things we're talking about: savings, investments, and how you sort of borrowing habits. If everybody today, when I use my iPhone, by the end of the week, I have a sense of, did I do more social media? Did I do more studying? The iPhone is able to pull out that information and give me back. If we could even have some tools like that, where every month people begin to just internalize, this is important data, how can I change my behavior? And then we give them the information on how to change your behavior. We will actually be making a lot more progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Songwe. And just to reassure our audience is that Dr. Songwe is sharing her own views about the incentivizing of regulators. We've not coerced her in any way to say things on our behalf. John, The last question for this panel discussion before we take the questions from the audience. You've been supporting lots of countries and you've been fighting financial crime at its highest heights. So what would be, in a nutshell, the message that you would like to share, or the information you would like to impart to us as a central bank, and also to regulators, to banks and financial institutions, as to how to better protect consumers and better protect ourselves, first of all?
Thank you. I'm going to use a COVID analogy as it's topical and easy to understand. So we can either protect ourselves by herd immunity and all get infected with fraud and cybercrime, which is increasing, or we can make bad financial decisions and learn the hard way by losing a lot of money. That's not what we want, right? That's not what we want. We want to go the other way. And if we don't go the other way, then that's the only outcome that's likely, right? And the other way is the vaccine. And the vaccine is a combination of things that my panelists have already said, right? It includes education, obviously, it includes understanding, but it also includes behaviors. And during COVID, we've learned to change our behaviors. I mean, you're all sitting there with masks on now, right? It's not nice, but we get used to it. We don't shake hands anymore. We give ourselves distance. We do virtual conferences, and it's learning the things we need to learn in order to be successful in the modern world, with a plethora of technologies and a number of very different financial relationships. I mean, I was counting the other day. I think I've got 15 different financial relationships. If I add them all up from different places. 20 years ago, I had one. And my access point was going to see my local bank manager one-to-one. I knew who he was, and we had a discussion around, what I wanted, whether that be a mortgage or a pension or whatever it is. It's all changed now. So also what has to change are good behaviors, and we need to model those, but also teach people what they are. And again, as the last panelist said, habits. We need to get good habits and pass those good habits on. We all know what they are. The Bank of Mauritius has got some great learnings and some great materials that are on its website, and we can all supplement that. I would say finally that the thing that also worries me is that traditionally with economic crime, it was all about drugs, and it was about prostitution, it was about smuggling of goods, and that converted into cash, and cash went into banks, and banks can kind of see that. It's not that difficult, albeit it gets more complex. It's now changed very much. If fraud and cyber are the things that people make money out of, then generally speaking, that means they're online and they're digital. And that it's not about cash in the same respect as it used to be. And when it's about digital and it's online, then that's got to move somewhere. It's got to move out of the victim's account somewhere else. And it comes into our banks, and it comes into mule accounts, and then it wanders off all the way around the world, and it's hard to get hold of. We need to do better at understanding the fraud threats from an indirect basis or a transit basis within our institutions, not just protecting our customers from fraud, but also understand where conduits for those fraud proceeds being transmitted for the benefit of the criminals. And we need to get better at that. We've generally had fraud and AML in separate silos within financial institutions. They're doing different things. They need to come together. Call it FRAML if you like, fraud AML, call it sci-fi, cyber financial crime. But if your fraud team and your AML team are not speaking to each other, you've got a problem. And that would be my last recommendation to you.
And a very important recommendation. Thank you, John, for that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now the floor is open to questions. We'll be, in the interest of time, we'll be taking quite a few questions, and also I'll be requesting the panelists who will be answering them to be quite concise in their responses. Please, floor is open. Is there any question from regulators? Maybe a question. I see Bunny showing some interest. Maybe a question to Dr. Songwei.
Hi, Vera, how are you? Just as a representation of the Bankers Association, I just wanted to get an understanding of your perspectives of how you have seen the regulator and the Banking Association collaborate to deliver a better financial literacy program for the audience in the country. Thank you.
Should I respond right away?
Please, Dr. Songwei. We're all ears.
I'm following orders. No, thank you. Listen, we have the African Bankers Association, And I must also congratulate them for the work that they're doing. I know in the last 2 meetings that I attended, first chaired by Egypt and then chaired by Rwanda, there's always been a segment where there is a conversation around what the central bankers can do and should be doing to improve financial literacy. So I think there is already an awareness of that, and that's the beginning, right? Is to say, yes, we do have a responsibility and a role to play in this area. I think the second step, which is sort of one step down, is then how do we translate what the central bankers clearly see, and we're witnessing it here today with the launch of this financial literacy course by the Bank of Mauritius, into, how do we work with then the retail sector, the retail segment of the banking sector, to say, how are we translating this? What is that agreement now between the central banks and, the banking sector? I talked initially about harmonization of regulation, maybe harmonization also of these courses, which will, one, reduce the cost of, if every bank were to give a financial literacy course, but it was the same. I think, as John just said, you started with one financial interlocutor and you ended up with 15, but what we would like is that the 15 are giving you the same literacy advice in some sense. So if we could, agree on some kind of standardization process that then allows central banks across the continent to provide that to retail banking and also the internet segment, I think that will be particularly important and particularly powerful. And probably we're beginning that process today, because you need sort of somebody to begin, and then, bringing together the South Africans and Mauritius and a couple of others. I think we can then, say, yes, this is what we need and this is how we deploy it, will be my sense of the work that needs to happen. I think what you tend to find is not that the retail segment is not doing anything already, but what you tend to find is that each sort of financial provider provides some amount of advice around their sector, but not sort of the comprehensive toolkit, right? So you may get a bank that thinks that, small and medium loans are what they do, giving you that advice, but not giving you advice on retirement, not giving you advice on savings. You may get a savings institution just giving you advice on that. I think what we need to then do is see whether we have platforms where you can get a little bit of all of that, right? Because, you need to start saving for retirement 20 years before you begin. And so you need that information at that point and not the day before you sort of go on retirement. So again, I come back to this point on harmonization and saying this is not to say there is not financial literacy happening on the continent. It may be happening in very secluded environments. And I think pooling together those resources will probably, get us to scale in terms of the amount of people that we reach with, a sufficient amount of information.
Please, Matthew, I'll take Daniel's questions just after yours.
Yeah, Matthew, your Standard Chartered Bank. My question would be to John Kuzak and Dr. Vera Song. We talk about banking literacy, for financial services literacy, but also financial services inclusion. We look at the continent, we look at it from the continent perspective. We're seeing that a global bank are de-risking the continent from the financial crime perspective by exiting the continent in the context where you should have a combination of global, regional, and indigenous players. I'm talking about the banking industry in driving both financial literacy and financial inclusion. John, to you, what could be done in terms of reducing the cost of financial crime risk across the continent to maintain global players and attract some more other global players to come and join indigenous, regional, and global players to drive financial inclusion and financial literacy? That would be to you. To Dr. Songwe, what we're seeing, you said it very well, Dr. Songwe, and Mauritius is a very interesting case where you have a high level of banking inclusion, if we may call it that way. 90% of Mauritians have a bank account. Unlike in the continent where we know very well, Dr. Songwe, the banking penetration rate is low, average 30%. Whereas in Mauritius, we do have indeed a high banking penetration rate or banking financial services inclusion, if we may call it that way. But then we have a problem of banking literacy. as we just talking about. In the continent, we have both problems. We have both banking penetration rate problem and banking literacy. Which lesson can you learn from Mauritius to migrate at least the success on the banking penetration rate on the continent?
If I could just ask the respondents just to be very concise in the answers, because we're running quite short of time and we still have another part of the event to unfold. Please, dear panelists, please, the floor is yours.
Would you like to go
Let
first?
John, why don't you go ahead and then I'll agree with you.
Okay, I'll be really quick. Of course, it was the honor of my life to lead financial crime compliance globally at Standard Chartered Bank for 5 years, from 2014. And we had a decision to take when a lot of banks were called de-risking Africa and the Caribbean and Pacific Islands. We had a choice to either join that club and say goodbye because the risks were perceived, not real, but perceived as being too high, especially to some regulators in large international financial centers. That was the perception. The reality is somewhat different when you take the threat versus the response into full consideration. We took a different view, and I'm so proud that we did. We did de-risking through education, which is what we called it, which is not de-risking and exiting. It's helping people understand the nature of the obligation and helping them meet the requirements that are high in order that we can continue to bank successfully on an ongoing basis. We can't have it both ways, right? We can't say that we're not going to help when we've got the capability to do so. We can't just be walking away from countries recognizing that their international settlements of international currencies are at jeopardy. We just can't do that. Standard Chartered's here for good. That's its moniker. It can't de-risk wholesale if it believes in the reason, the rationale for its existence. Now that took a lot of work. It took a lot of work, took a lot of resources, took a lot of time. We've been everywhere with that program, and the people at Standard Chartered are still doing that, and they should be really proud of that. It's not easy, but it's about engagement, it's about education, about awareness. Exactly the same thing we're talking about here. Financial awareness is not just for individuals; it's also for for financial institutions too.
Dr. Songwe, maybe your views quickly on that question of Mathieu Bandeng.
Thank you, Mathieu. I think two things. One, what we're doing here today is part of the solution, right? Is learning and sharing experience. And the second thing is we have the unique possibility now, because of all this internet and digital tools, to reach more people much faster. And my sense is take advantage of it, do it quickly. And Kenya went from 23% access with Safaricom and Equity Bank, and to huge, almost 83% now of Kenyans have access to basic financial services. That also means that 83% of Kenyans have access to financial literacy platforms if we decide to offer it to them. So the decision then to offer it to them, I think we have a huge opportunity now with the kind of platforms we have to really reach more people, and then learn from the experience of Mauritius about, it's not a question of who you reach, but it's also how you send out the education. If you send it in very complicated ways, nobody reads it. If you do it in simple and accessible ways in different languages for different parts of the population, I think it gets much easier. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Songwe. Daniel, maybe the last question will be yours. So please go ahead and shoot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Liz. I had a very quick one to invite maybe the comments of the panelists on the best practice that they've experienced in their markets where they work in relation to the digital transition in the retail space for banks. And as Mathieu said, I think Mauritius has a high rate of banking penetration, but the sophistication of use is actually quite low. People have a savings account and a debit card and still use an extensive network of branches, well over 100 branches in Mauritius. We also have a fairly educated population, but it's basic literacy. So you then have people who have a bit of money, a bit of education, and a bank account, but aren't using it optimally. So during the COVID pandemic, at the level of the association and a number of commercial banks have been running campaigns to tell people to use remote channels, to really make use of their cards, for example, and also not to fall prey to scams. And this has actually helped. One of the few positive aspects of COVID have been an uptake in digital channels. But at the same time as we're doing this and changing behavior, customer behavior, we're also actually encouraging to take greater risks that maybe they're not used to taking. And so that ends up being a fairly complex message that you tell people. You tell them, change the way in which you behave, but you know, all these fairly complicated risks to people who have not necessarily that high level of complex education. So coming from Marcus, where this process is underway or has been completed, would you be able to share some thoughts on a high level in terms of how we can strike this balance between getting the message right, ensuring this very positive transition, while giving a simple message that is clear but effective? Grateful for your concise pearls of wisdom on this. Thank you.
Maybe a quick roundtable on that one. So we'll start maybe with Madam Gopal.
That's a very interesting question, Danielle. I must say that during the pandemic, we had a lot of challenges in Mauritius with lockdowns and with restricted access to banking facilities. And I must here give credit to the MBA. We had a very good working relationship with the MBA to provide access to the people. We did not have any interruption, if I may say so, in respect of banking facilities. Myself and the governor and the other deputy governor, we were at the bank, if I may say so, during both lockdowns. We were at the bank every day and monitoring the situation and working together with the MBA. But definitely, Daniel, I think at the level of the bank, we need to work together, have more targeted programs, and probably learn with what Dr. Vera Songwe has said earlier on the African market, how we need to address these issues together as a regulator and with our stakeholders. Have to develop, have to have targeted approach and use the digital platform to have more targeted and programs to achieve the objectives, be they students, be they elderly people, women, SMEs, etc. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Gopal. Maybe one-liners from everyone in the due to constraints with regard to time. Dr. Songwe.
I mean, no, my sense will be that the beginning is bringing the regulators and the service providers, so the financial sector together much more often to begin to understand what are the changing financial products that are being offered and what more lessons we need to send to the consumers. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Waldron?
I think Daniel's question is excellent because what it suggests is the proxy for financial inclusion is not necessarily an account. And I thought that there's a rethink because I think the Findex data in particular that's showing account penetration increase is not correlating highly with using the account. That's what Daniel's flagging. And so maybe the better proxy is ultimately household resiliency. And that's what we need to develop proxies for when we talk about inclusion, because just because I'm connected to the system doesn't mean I'm really included in the system. And I think there's a rethink going on around that as you begin to kind of approach redefining the proxies of financial inclusion. That, of course, involves financial literacy programs in terms of that out.
John, you have the final word, I would say, on this one.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about trying to summarize into a single message what I tell people about something that's really complex. In my world, 22 predicate offenses, thousands and thousands and thousands of different ways of laundering money. And what I come to in the end is a phrase which I've used a lot, which is be diligent, be vigilant, be curious. And then critically think again if something doesn't make sense. I can't teach you everything. I can't tell you everything, but you do know, you do get a feeling when something doesn't make sense or something doesn't add up. All I ask of people at that moment is you don't just sign, or you don't just click, or you don't just say yes. You start thinking, you ask some more questions, you buy yourself some time. And so for me, think again if it doesn't make sense is something I've used very successfully over many years.
Thank you so much, John. And dear panelists, thank you so much for having shared these valuable views and unique insights. I would encourage you, if there's any other question that might come to the mind of of our audience and the online followers, they might send the questions to the Bank of Mauritius on communications@beyond.mu. I would just like you to be the witnesses to a most important event for the Bank of Mauritius, which will be the launch of the financial literacy strategy. Governor, if I could please invite you to come to the lectern. So, Governor, because we are talking of a digital era, we'll be using the technology to launch that. So if you're fine with this, Governor, we'll be proceeding with the launch of the website.
Sure.
So please, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be just asking the Governor just to click on the launch button. This will open the webpage of the Bank of Mauritius. I understand that there is a problem only with the visual aspect of it on the screen, Governor, but it's a page that has been created in the wake of the launch of the financial literacy strategy. And please, Governor, if you click again on the button, you'll be opening the very first document that the Bank of Mauritius has provided. It's a document that speaks of financial fraud, as a matter of fact, and we thank all the departments within the bank, especially the supervision department, for having helped us in crafting this document. Rest assured that on their screens, at home or in their offices, the display will be very correct. So please. Well, that's one of the drawbacks of technology sometimes, Governor. But please, this is something which you can scroll on your iPad, Governor. And given that it's the very first document we have forward of the Governor, and it speaks about types of financial fraud, also precautions that consumers and the public at large will need to follow. We will be also having, in the course of the year, as soon as sanitary restrictions are waived, we'll be having face-to-face sessions with students, with crowds of consumers in various audiences, locally and also in Rodrigues Garden. Governor, thank you for having launched this website. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having followed this event here physically, and also thank you to all the followers online. We thank you so much for having participated to this milestone. And we look forward to engaging with the Mauritian population so that we can also together promote financial literacy. Thank you so much.